Welcome to the Health Edge, translating the science of self-care. I am Mark Pettis. Glad to be with you and with my friend, colleague, Dr. John Bagnulo. John, good morning.
Hey, good morning, Mark. It's great to see you, man.
Great to see you, as always. We looked at a paper recently, John, that I think will be fun to share with our listeners. And it's a study that I know many people in the health podcasting world have been looking at, that attempts to compare the health benefits of light versus moderate versus vigorous physical activity. And this is a paper that came out of the UK from the UK Biobank, right, where they look at thousands of people, kind of like our NHANES database here in America, and came up with some really interesting equivalencies, if you will, of how, a minute of vigorous activity compares to moderate to light. And historically, at least in my mind, those relationships have usually been characterized, 1 minute of vigorous activity is equal to maybe 2 minutes of more moderate activity. And, should we be pushing hard? Should we be suggesting that lighter activity has less value? And for a lot of people that I work with, there's just a lot of confusion about exercise and activity levels. And, if I can't sprint, does that mean I can't do anything to improve my health trajectory? And so this was a very good study that looked at this in a more quantifiable way. And I thought it would be a good basis, John, for you and I to review a little bit about the current guidelines, because they're often talked about how many minutes per week of light or moderate or vigorous. But at the end of the day, where does that come from, and just how powerful are those interventions? And we'll try to add a little clarity to that in this discussion.
Yeah. I think it's a great segue into the kind of the more general topic about what type of adaptations does the cardiovascular and other areas of our body, what type of adaptations result from the different levels of intensity? Because I think, at the end of the day, you and I always talk about positive stress, versus stress overload, right? In anything, whether that's psychological or physical. And, I think that this really gives us a better understanding of how those adaptations and those responses take place to different intensities, because that's what we're trying to do when we exercise. We're trying to create adaptations that provide a better quality of health and longevity, and, really make the aging process, a much better process and experience. So I think it's great. It's a great lead into that. And to your point, there is a lot of confusion about, well, just move. We always hear that, like, just move. It doesn't matter what you're doing. And I do think there is still a lot of value to that. Like, it's better to move than to sit. So, but then at the end of the day, like, if someone only has so much time, or the way they perceive it, they only have so much time in the day to exercise, if they can commit to it, are they going to get more value, from really going all out? This would suggest yes, but we can dive into it now.
Great, John. As we like to say, right? Motion is the lotion.
Yeah.
And as I think we have known for a long time, historically, there is a dose response, and hopefully people can feel more hopeful about tailoring whatever they're capable of into their lifestyles as at least an understanding that they're doing something good for themselves, even if it's not sprinting or in ultra marathons. And as we touched on a little bit in our last podcast, there probably is a post-peak level of activity that for some can have some negative impacts longer term on cardiac function and inflammation and things like that. So I've got a few slides here that I'll pull up, John, just really more just to sort of set the context for the study and to just help our listeners understand these definitions. they are widely accepted, and definitely, no matter which consensus you're looking at, they will be quite similar.
And what I like about this, Mark, and again, thank you for these slides. I think these are incredibly helpful to our listeners. What I really like is that you use, and the authors of this study, but you in forming these slides use like perceived exertion through like breath. Can you talk? Because so many of the papers before this use a percentage of VO2 max. And that's really hard for people to understand and to
Yes.
try to place themselves in one of those categories, like 90% of VO2 max. I think for many people, they don't, it's hard. It's hard to determine like what percentage of that they're at. And even heart rates can be difficult at times. So I really like the way that, the vigorous, moderate, and light is determined by like, what can you do in terms of a conversation or singing or things like that.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. I agree. Unless somebody really is sort of technically proficient, really likes the science, you can quickly lose people when you start talking about MVO2
Yeah.
and even while heart rate now is so readily measured, I do think it's still a little bit confusing when people talk about 60% max heart rate, 80% max heart rate,
Yeah, and Mark, there's a lot of flaws with the max heart rate equation. The whole minus your age and things like that. There are a lot of flaws with that equation that a lot of people still use to determine their max heart rate. And I've heard some interesting stories about how that equation was developed, and there's not as much science behind that. It's sort of like drink 8-ounce glasses of water a day. It's kind of like it's a fuzzy background to that. So that's why I try to also stay away from the max heart rate equation. But 220 minus your age for our listeners.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And this is obviously a gradient, and the talk test. I apply this myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Elliptical, and if I can sing the tune that's playing on my iPhone, I might push a little harder. And so these are nice subjective. And it gives people just more awareness, I think, of how hard they're breathing and how vigorous their activity is in that particular moment. So,
one thing I'll add to this that a couple exercise physiologists I know well and I talk to have said that for people that aren't talking or singing, but let's say they're watching a show on the treadmill, I've heard this from multiple sources that if you can follow the show and enjoy the show to its fullest extent, you're probably in the light to moderate range.
yeah,
If you're in the vigorous range, you're probably not catching everything that's being said in the show, and you're not enjoying it very much.
that's great.
But
Yeah. Yeah, and that for those who can't see this slide, and we'll put these up on our website, thehealthedgepodcast.com. Light activity. You could talk, you could sing easily, and to the point you just made, John, it would not be unlike sitting, but the effort here is light, and this might include casual walking, cooking, light chores, stretching, just to use some examples. Where moderate activity, right, you can talk but not sing the words to a song. Certainly, people will notice more effort, harder breathing. If they check their pulse or have a heart rate device, certainly their heart rate will be higher. And this would be activities like brisk walking, a 15-minute mile, for example, light cycling, maybe playing doubles in tennis, raking, just to give a few examples. And then vigorous activity where, you're going to be a bit more breathless, and it's going to be hard to put a sentence together, hard, if not impossible, to be singing a song. Certainly, you're not going to be following the show that you're watching in much detail. And then, of course, the perception of that is that you're going to be breathing rapidly, usually will be sweating, And so running, jogging, swimming, hiking uphill, whatever that activity is, that would be the talk and the perceived exertion of that. So that, I know a lot of our listeners know this, but it helps to just start with some definitions and how we frame these categories. And again, these have been recommendations for some time now, but from the Heart Association, getting at least 150 minutes per week of moderate to intense, we would call that vigorous aerobic activity, or 75 minutes per week of vigorous. So again, it's that 2-to-1 ratio where the suggestion here is that 1 minute of vigorous activity would be equal to about 2 minutes of moderate intensity. And if over the course of the week you're clocking 150 minutes at moderate, 75 of vigorous, this would be sort of the floor. This is where your higher might be better, but this would be a good weekly target. And then importantly, not the complete focus of what we're talking about today, but you and I often talk about the importance of resistance activity. And resistance activity obviously is essential for muscle mass, lean body mass, metabolic health, right? Strength, power, endurance, and one can get their heart rate up and move more air through their lungs with resistance activity. And so there are ways that one can sort of combine the two, but generally they're thought of as sort of separate categories of physical activity. And as we all know, sitting is just not very health promoting, and a lot of research is now consistent with that. Self-evident as that would be, and we know that even light activity can offset prolonged sedentary states from a health perspective. So more is better, whether that's the area under the curve time-wise on any given day or week, but certainly the level of intensity, the higher one goes up that gradient, the more health promoting they're likely to see their outcomes. It's pretty self-evident, John, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is, I think this is stuff that our listeners and, really fully appreciate that, we're just a very sedentary population, and the goal is to be moving more, sitting less. And, I think what's interesting, and we'll get into it here with these results, but it's, you've got a lot of things happening in the body when we sit that are associated, believe it or not, with a stressful situation. Evolutionarily, if we looked at it, the only time our ancestors would have sat in one place for a long time is if things were really bad outside of the cave, right? And I think that what's fascinating about that is that, that situation, 50, 100, 200,000 years ago, now the body misinterprets that. When we sit 4 or 5 hours at a desk, the body starts to have that same type of response, right? With everything, blood sugar preservation, cortisol, again, you can speak to it more eloquently than I can, but so it's like you got to try to stay out of that negative stress state, sitting in one place, and just move. If you just move lightly, like, again, we're going to get into that. And this study would say, well, there aren't as many benefits to that type of movement, but it's better to be moving throughout the day with no prescribed exercise than to sit for 7 or 8 hours at a desk and maybe get 30 minutes of moderate to light or whatever. So I think that's where it gets really interesting, is when you start to have that context of all of the changes in the body when we sit for prolonged periods of time. Again, there's just those associations that we're in a place of danger, so to speak, because that's where our ancestors would have been. It's really interesting.
That is a really great point, John. And I love that that evolutionary biologic lens, which we apply so much of the research and our
Right.
experiences of life into modern states of prolonged sitting, sedentary states is not a normal or natural human condition.
Right.
And so I love
Right.
that context, because most people who are at their computer 8 hours a day aren't going to perceive that they're creating a stress response. Uh, and even though it's 2025, our highly evolved brains will, right? They don't know that you're sitting in front of a
Yeah.
computer. You could be out in the African savannah with an injured leg, with a serious infection, and that's a very different biologic response. And so when we look at that research of how prolonged sitting or sedentary states has adverse health outcomes, it's a risk, right? This is not an innocuous, well, I'm just sitting. It's harm. You are harming yourself, and that context is so interesting because we forget where we've come from, right? And when you look
Yeah.
at
That's it.
Hanukkah, when you look at the Okinawan, when you look at some of these more ancestral ways of life, they have periods where they're sitting, and
Of
resting
course.
and
Yeah. Of
eating, and
course.
peak sun, they're in the shade. Um,
Yeah.
but for the most part, they're moving regularly with periodic sprints, uh, and they're not wearing accelerometers, they're not wearing smartwatches, they're not on treadmills, they don't have gyms. The Hansa don't use gym memberships to promote their health, right? This is just the evolved way to be engaging the environments that you're in, and so it really isn't rocket science at the end of the day, but it helps to sort of. I love that context, John. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me get my slides back up here. Um, and so you had shared this study this morning, John, with me. This was the one of the more recent studies from the Heart Association and Circulation that was the basis upon these recommendations of 150 minutes a week, um, moderate, 75, for vigorous, and some of the data that formed the basis of that in terms of health benefit. And it is, I do think that for those that wear accelerometers, there are many forms of movement that we might not necessarily see as exercise, but, when you start looking at, whether it's yard work, doing aerobics, some forms of yoga, the vinyasa, power yoga,
Mm.
playing tennis, these all really add up over the course of one's day, over the course of
Yeah.
one's week, in terms of just moving in more than one sort of plane, right? You're moving through your three-dimensional environment, arms, legs, and not static. And so there are so many ways to do that without being in a treadmill or just pounding yourself or feeling like you have to pound yourself. And of course, as we talked about some of those stratifications of activity level, certainly when you get into vigorous physical activity where you're becoming breathless and you're getting your heart rate up and moving much higher volumes of air through your lungs, obviously that's going to require, whether that's, running, swimming, dancing, biking, and even things that we did as kids all the time, right? Jumping rope,
Yeah.
playing, heavier yard work, things like that. So, uh, I so one message here is that this doesn't have to be the typical sort of gym like activity. There are many ways that one can. I'm sort of in my semi-retired state now, John. I do a lot more housework. and yard work. And, even on our snowy mornings when I'm out shoveling, I now see that as an invitation. Though it's a
Yeah.
pain in the neck being out in frigid weather, uh, it I see it as a gift. It's like, wow, I can really get my heart rate up, and I'm breathing hard
Yeah.
out here shoveling. I'm outside.
Total body
Total
exercise,
body, right?
using your core. It's functional. Yeah.
Yes, and so it for me personally, it's transformed sort of the mindful way in which I will engage activity, vacuuming in the house. I going up the stairs, instead of just slowly walking upstairs, I'll jog up our little flight of stairs to the upstairs bedroom, down into the basement, and so there are so many ways that one can really embrace and be mindful that a lot of the things that might have kind of a negative connotation attached to it can really be seen as
As an opportunity.
fun, as an opportunity.
Opportunity. That's it. That's the key to life, in my opinion. See things that you might otherwise look at as a chore, as something that's tedious, something that might have some discomfort, but always try to see those as opportunities, because we always have a choice, right? That's one of my favorite Buddhist philosophies. We always have a choice.
Yes,
And I think it's always good to see things, if we can, take that choice as, it's an opportunity. And to your point, like, look, the weather, I mean, here in New Hampshire, I mean, I would say at times it's horrendous, right? And I try to embrace it, but it's, it's cold for several months, and especially right now here in December, there's very little light, but I still try to get outside.
yeah,
I try to get outside. I try to embrace it. I try to look at it as, okay, I'm going to get outside. I'm going to have cold exposure in my face. So hopefully that thermogenesis is going to help me in one way or another as an adaptation, right? I'm going to get PPAR activity going, maybe activate some brown adipose tissue. Then I say to myself, I live here next to an amazing big preserve of land, recreation area. I'm going to get out and I'm going to go up these hills, as fast as I can, and I'm going to recover on my downhills, and I'm going to just integrate some interval training, because that's something that I think our listeners could really benefit from, understanding that concept of interval training. We hear about it and it sounds technical. It sounds like you need a watch, and I don't think you really do. And I think it really embodies so much of what you've covered, Mark, so far this morning, which is, when you are in light and moderate intensity and you can breathe easy, your body is still demanding oxygen, right? And your mitochondria they're burning fat. And I can't remember who said it. You would probably know, Mark, but someone said you could really predict all-cause mortality rates for any population based on how much fat they burn over the course of their life. Right? I forget who said that, but they're one of the more contemporary researchers in the area of mitochondrial health
yes,
and yeah. And so what we're doing when we exercise or we're active is we're asking for more oxygen delivery. And because of that, whether it's light or moderate, whether it's a huge amount of time under the curve or it's really intense, the body has to adapt to that. And all the different adaptations that take place meet the intensity or the criteria of that situation. So in interval training, one thing we learned, I learned in exercise physiology, I was fortunate enough to minor in that in both of my graduate programs, is that you have like 4 or 5 different adaptations that the cardiovascular system and cellular physiology are stimulated for with different scenarios. So when you have really high intensity training, which in an interval type training would be maybe 10 to 30% of your time. If you go out for a walk and let's say every 10 telephone poles, if you're walking on a highway or walking on a road with telephone poles, if every one, or you could go 2 telephone poles, you could run, which is roughly 200 feet. If you ran for 200 feet and then you recovered with brisk walking for the next 800, like that's interval training. And you're looking at, probably it's going to end up being somewhere around 10 to 20% of your total time is at a higher intensity, and 80% would be at a moderate intensity. Well, in those high intensity windows, you have more stress on your left ventricle, right? Because it's working harder, it's trying to push more blood, and there's some real significant benefits with respect to left ventricular function and the strength of those contractions. And you could even say that there's some enlargement, right? You're going to get greater stroke volume if you do this for 6 to 8 months. I mean, that's what a lot of the research has shown as one of the biggest adaptations cardiovascular wise, is you get this improved ventricular function and more stroke volume when you have interval training in place and you have that high intensity component. So that's huge. But then at those moderate intensities, when you back off, you train your body to metabolize lactic acid. So the body starts developing these lactic acid dehydrogenase enzymes that you have different isomers, and there's LDH, 1 through like 5 or 6. And these different molecules have greater affinities for lactic acid based on how you've trained. And if you can train your body to catabolize and use lactic acid as a fuel instead of something that's debilitating and really, really uncomfortable when it accumulates, that again is another great adaptation that takes place when you weave in some higher intensity windows with lower intensity or moderate intensity windows. So, and then you've got the whole thing about mitochondrial density as well as capillary density in the working muscles. Those take place at all levels of intensity, but there might be an argument for that 80% of time when you're at a moderate intensity, when you go for a walk or a run or you're on a bike or whatever it is you're doing, you might be building more capillary density, which is great, right? Because that prevents muscle atrophy. That prevents just more functional muscles. It makes you better at burning fat at any given intensity. So there's just so many upsides to each of these components. And I think it's important to, like you and I always talk about, Mark, with fasting once in a while or going ketogenic for a week, whether it's once a month or every 3 months. You know what you do? You maintain metabolic flexibility. And I think that's what different intensities of exercise offer us as well. I think it's just metabolic flexibility, and you need to be able to adjust. You need to that high intensity window, but you also need to move for extended periods of time during the day so that you have all of your different pathways as options, right? Physiologically for you. And that's the way I try to look at exercise is I just want to be as metabolically flexible as possible. I want to be able to burn glycogen when I need to, because, that's going to be at the highest intensity. And there's a lot of upside to burning through your glycogen stores and what that offers you for, days after that. And, so I know I got really long-winded there, but I love these papers because it shows that, look, if you only got a limited amount of time during the day that you're going to say, this is prescribed exercise, I'm going to go out, whether I go to the gym or I go to the woods or I go to the park, I got to, you got to have some discomfort there, at least with your state of breathless, right? You're breathless for a period of time because you're placing a very favorable stressor on your cardiovascular, your pulmonary system to deliver more oxygen. And I think you should embrace some of that. But then at the same time, don't look at the rest of the day as the time when you should just sit, try to move lightly, whether you have a walking desk, whether you get on the treadmill when you want to do some work that requires, some ability to focus and you can't really go all out, but you're going to be moving. And I think the combination of these things, provides us with different adaptations that, that's really, I think, the kind of the mix that you want to create.
That's a great overview, John, of that sort of continuum and the unique and complementary benefits, no matter where one may be on that continuum. And it's we talked a little bit about these these metabolic equivalents, and I think that the talk test, the perception of effort, one doesn't need sophisticated equipment measuring oxygen consumption and CO2 production as a way of getting a sense subjectively of where you might be on that continuum. And we and I also love, just in the examples that you gave there, John, that no matter what we might be doing, there are ways to adapt what we're doing to take full advantage of the benefits that each of these levels of activity create. And I love that the telephone pole analogy was one that resonated with me. And that was many years ago, and I started to just get my life into a better place.
Yeah.
And I've shared this story, but 25 years ago, I was 20 pounds heavier and insulin resistant and hypertensive, and oh, by the way, I had all the same things that my parents had. So, all my doctors and providers, who were really tremendous people, said, "Oh, it's genetic. This is the cards you've been dealt, right?" And even today, that continues to be sort of the paradigm. And so, if it all began to shift when I saw that 10th telephone pole as an invitation to really pick it up, right? Almost as if somebody were following me that was a threat. You play these games, and it's amazing how your mind can get you to do things that you might otherwise never consider. And so I love how one can use their mind, their imagery, narratives that we might share to ourselves internally. There are many ways that you can begin to coach yourself to, your ultimately, we have all these amazing tools that if they're collecting dust, then they're tools that we'll just never use or realize the benefit of. So.
Yeah.
Just a summary as we get into the actual study, John, because the study that we'll look at here uses accelerometers, and with all the many devices that are out there today to measure activity, I thought it would help just to give a quick overview of how an accelerometer might differ than something that's simply measuring steps. And accelerometers, as we touched on, really will measure movement across all spatial planes, right? We're in this three-dimensional reality, and this will measure movement, arms, legs, hands, wrists, in those different planes. And, the amount of data, real-time data, and the extent to which now AI and more sophisticated algorithms can take that data and translate it is becoming more and more meaningful in terms of the feedback we get. So an accelerometer is really looking at all that raw data and then generating not just the intensity of the exercise, but it can also measure steps. And so an accelerometer can give you a step count, but something that measures steps only will not be able to give you, as an accelerometer will, the intensity, the magnitude of that effort. And so that's an important distinction, certainly as it relates to the study that we'll look at. Any other thoughts or comments there, John?
No, I just think it's great because, again, I mentioned this earlier. I think what's lost in translation is just this concept of movement and the fact that you're needing to consume more oxygen. And it doesn't have to be measured through VO2 max. We know that for every muscle contraction, depending on the intensity, if the cardiopulmonary system can meet that, then you're going to do that. If you can't, you've crossed what we call the lactic acid threshold, which would be the most extreme, the most intense, intense type of exercise. And I just think that it's great that when you talk about these, these different wearables that are out there, right? Some are going to just And you could consider the stepometer or whatever you call those, right? That's measuring movement, lower body, of course. But now there's just all these different ways to kind of quantify movement. But at the end of the day, regardless of whether someone's wearing a stepometer, they're wearing a much more advanced wearable that's going to get upper body movement. I think what we're trying to capture here that our listeners can understand is just muscle contraction equals oxygen consumption, right? The faster, the stronger the muscle contractions, the more vigorous that happens in any given time, and the more oxygen is being consumed. And really what we're trying to quantify here is how much oxygen is being demanded of your muscles. And so I love that we get different perspectives on that over the course of this conversation.
Great. All right.
And I know, Mark, and we're not going to get into it today, but they now have different devices where people, there's things you can breathe into, right? They're going to measure carbon dioxide to oxygen ratios. There's, and they're in wearable form. It's really fascinating where we've gotten in terms of the technology here, to what people are doing with the oxygen they're consuming. It's pretty remarkable. Maybe we'll get into that at a later date.
Yeah. I think that whole big and exploding topic of biometrics and wearables and
oxygen consumption.
So here's the study. This was published earlier this year, and this was from I think Nature. Which is a great journal. I mean, it's one of my top 3 or 4. Yeah, mine as well. And this is wearable device-based health equivalents of different physical activity intensities against mortality, cardiometabolic disease, and cancer. So that's a pretty global, comprehensive title there. And this slide is an attempt at summarizing the study. And I do, as I recall, this was open access. So I will put some other pertinent studies up on our website. But again, as we looked at historically, we've had this self-reported data where we've suggested that 1 minute of vigorous activity equates to 2 minutes of moderate activity. This study challenges that sort of conventional meme, again, looking at accelerometer-derived intensity. And this was the UK Biobank. So this is a large database of thousands of people in the UK, kind of like our NHANES. At least that's my way of sort of comparing here in America. And so 73,458 participants. It was an 8-year follow-up. And so they had baseline assessments using accelerometers. They weren't instructed to, do different levels of activity.
Right.
They just lived their lives. And as you would expect, there were many that had more regular, vigorous physical activity. Many were more sedentary and had just light activity. And then there was that gradient in between of moderate activity. And so they were able to measure that. And then over that 8-year period, look at health outcomes. And the outcomes that they looked at were all-cause mortality, so death from any cause. Then they looked at mortality from cardiovascular disease. This is usually a heart attack, cardiac arrest. And then they looked at chronic complex disease risk, diabetes, cancer, and correlated at the end of this study. What was the correlation? So this was a observational study of the exercise intensity with the likelihood of dying from any cause, dying from a cardiovascular cause, getting diabetes, acquiring cancer. And of course, at baseline, they attempted to exclude all those conditions so that the assumption is that anything that emerged during this 8-year follow-up was new for that individual. And So essentially, they found risk reduction uh, regardless of the level of activity, light, moderate, vigorous, anywhere from 5% on the low end to as much as 35% on the high end. And again, just by way of summary, 1 minute of vigorous physical activity was equal to about 4 minutes of moderate physical activity when it came to all-cause mortality risk reduction. So all-cause mortality
Yeah.
risk was reduced at all levels of activity, mostly seen with higher levels of activity. And again, this just attempted to quantify. If you looked at cardiovascular mortality, 1 minute of vigorous activity was comparable to about almost 8 minutes of
Yeah, that's crazy. That's unbelievable, isn't it?
physical activity. So that's
Yeah,
pretty
that's amazing. Yeah,
interesting, and that might be some incentive if you're out walking,
yeah,
to crank it up like someone's, as out there chasing you, uh,
yeah.
or if whatever you're doing, crank it up for a minute every 5 minutes or so, and so you're going to get more bang for your buck. Um, when you look at diabetes risk reduction, 1 minute of vigorous was equal to about 9 minutes of moderate activity for reducing diabetes risk. And then cancer risk reduction, 1 minute of vigorous activity was equal to about 3.5 minutes of moderate activity. So all these comparisons here were vigorous versus moderate. Uh, 1 minute of vigorous equaled about 53 minutes of light physical activity. And in the example of all cause mortality, that's where the benefit was greatest. Uh, so, no question, if you're pressed for time, really trying to get more bang for your buck, um, getting in a bit more vigorous activity will be the equivalent otherwise of what might otherwise be very relaxed walking, almost an hour. And so
Yeah.
those are, I'm going to pause for a minute, John, just to let you comment on this, but that's.
I think it's profound to think of, especially when you get into, the high intensity versus moderate. I think the low intensity is a little easier to appreciate because of you just consider low levels of oxygen demand that are placed with light activities. But to see the 1 minute of high or vigorous intensity, vigorous exercise to keep it consistent here with the findings and the way things are described, 1 minute of vigorous exercise equaling 8 minutes of moderate exercise for a risk reduction in cardiovascular events, and then 9 minutes for diabetes. That to me is profound, and I think it speaks, Mark, to the benefits or the adaptations required, and how that overlaps with what you need for cardiovascular benefits going forward, right? But with the diabetes risk reduction, why are higher intensities so much more protective than moderate? My mind starts to go in the different directions that are you knocking down glycogen stores and then creating place for dietary carbohydrate to be more safely stored before it just works against the body? That's, obviously one area. Or does it have more to do with, mitochondria densities increasing, and then you're better able to, because we know that the mitochondria are involved with so many facets of, I guess, insulin resistance. But it's really remarkable to have that type of ratio, 1 minute to 8 minutes or 1 minute to 9 minutes, for moderate intensity. That's very significant, and especially compared to what I like how you led into this with the prior notion where there's always 1 minute equals 2 minutes, right, of moderate. But this really this goes beyond challenging it. I'd say that it really blows that out of the water.
Yeah, I was really surprised as well at the magnitude of these comparisons. Um, I do think, and this is the last slide that is the data from the study, which I just summarized, looking again at all cause mortality, cardiovascular. These are metabolic. These are cardiac, cardiometabolic. That's what MACE is essentially referring to: major adverse cardiac events, um, and again, the vigorous to moderate, 1 to 4, 1 to 8, 1 to 5, and then they add the light, and you can see, you just need much more light activity to get the same adaptive. I love that the way that you frame that, John. The same adaptive benefit that you would with more vigorous, and I do. Given the magnitude of change here, I do think it's important, as we touched on earlier, John, that individuals who might be listening to this thinking, holy cow, I haven't had vigorous activity in a long time. I
Yeah,
thought walking was good for me.
it is. And
We,
the answer we want to be really clear is it is. Yeah.
that light activity
Yeah.
is not good for you. And again, this is a study that looked at mortality. Um, these are relative risk reductions. So, is that to say that you're maybe for all cause mortality, you might not quite realize the same benefit? But is it possible, just for example, that going out and walking my dog for 30 minutes each day, what's that going to do for my mood, maybe for my depression risk, for my pain? There are many out
Quality of life,
quality of life that
I
this
think improves with any movement. I really do. Yeah.
exactly. And so the study wasn't designed to look at those. I do think it's important to just point that out. Um, that there are so many attributes of light to moderate physical activity, but I do think that particularly as we're all pressed for time, anything we can do to diminish the amount of time we have to be committing to the exercise that we're doing, uh, looking at strategies to intermittently crank that up if your current state is complete sedentary states to light, um, is very much motivated by these study results. And then the last thing I'll say, John, and then I'll stop and let you finish for us, is that um, not everyone is ready to go from light to vigorous activity. There is a
Right.
process where if one wants to uh, go from a predominantly sedentary lifestyle, to do it in incremental steps. And so, going from 0 to 60 is not a safe way to be interpreting, what we're sharing here. One would want to very much incrementally work toward those ultimate goals. And anytime you can be working with a trainer, or a life coach, or even being with a friend maybe who's a bit more advanced than that continuum, can be very, very helpful. So um, this is it's the long game that we're talking about here,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so um, yeah, those are just some thoughts.
That's well said. That's really well said. I mean, I think that if someone is just getting into a more regular pattern of exercise and they want to take this information and say, hey, I want to get to some higher intensities. I really appreciate, what I'm seeing here for the potential benefits and risk reduction. I think starting out, one thing that can be really helpful, and that's what you just said, is allow your body to get into a steady state before you go to the next level of intensity or becomes more vigorous. And that steady state is just a point at which you're asking more of your cardiopulmonary system. You're asking for more oxygen because you're moving at a much higher rate than you have, but you do find that after a couple minutes, you get back to a place where you can breathe a little more comfortably, right? You don't feel as breathless. Then you've reached that steady state, and then you can maybe go to the next level. It can get a little more vigorous. Again, just to stay consistent with the terminology here this morning, but that reaching a steady state is, there's a lot of, again, a lot of benefit that takes place when you get there, and then you go to the next level, but just allow your body some time. Not only, and the micro time is when you are in a bout of exercise, give yourself a couple minutes to adapt to a faster pace before you go even faster again. This might sound like something that's really rudimentary, but a lot of people, to your point, go 0 to 60, right? They cross the lactic acid threshold. It becomes damn near impossible for them to do that more than a 30-second, 1 minute, and then they're done. There's soreness, and it's a deterrent to this becoming more of a sustainable way of life. And I think that's what, I love that you just said, is you got to make this sustainable. And I think that allowing yourself some time to adapt, to make those physiological adaptations to the more vigorous, higher intensity exercise. Start out with that one telephone pole. Maybe you're going to get to the point where every 10 telephone poles, you're going to be running 2 or 3. So embrace the discomfort, but don't let that discomfort be so severe or debilitating in that first bout of exercise that it's not something that you go out and look for again. And I think that's it. I mean, right? You got to have something you enjoy. You got to have something that you can do on a regular basis, because that's what this study also conveyed, right, Mark? It's that these people, they had, whether it was vigorous, whether it was moderate intensity, when you look at any population, this study would obviously speak to that, where you get that type of risk reduction, it's when it becomes a regular part of your life. And I think, the only way it's going to become a regular part of your life is if it's something that you can make it enjoyable. You can let it help you with your outlook on life. It can help you. It can work as an antidepressant. And I think it's, part of it's also what you said, see it as an opportunity. See that discomfort, whether it's for 10 minutes or 30 minutes, whatever that window of time is that it is, you're breathless and it's uncomfortable. See that as an opportunity for you to grow and to adapt in really unique ways that's going to improve your quality of life overall. So great topic. I love talking about exercise, Mark. I mean, we don't talk about it enough. So when we do, I really appreciate it. And I'm glad you brought this study to my attention. It's a good one.
Good stuff. A lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
About this, John. I really appreciate this. And all of our video, audio, the PowerPoint slides for those that are interested, and some of the articles that we reference that are open source will be on our website, thehealthedgepodcast.com. John, next week is Christmas week.
Yeah.
If,
right.
We can connect if you're free.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wednesday will be Christmas Eve, and we've talked about uric acid, which I love that topic as metabolic health goes. And there are some newer, I think, really important insights to use for folks. So let's
that would be great.
Papers and talk about that. So, John, always a pleasure, my friend.
Same here, buddy. I love you.
Love
Take
you.
Care.
You take care, bro.